The West isn't ready for what's coming after a failed coup, and now Captain Traoré's historic visit to Russia. Burkina Faso is on the verge of dismantling 2 centuries of Western dominance in Africa. But why would a sanctioned, insurgency-hit nation challenge the world's greatest powers? Let's find out. For many years, there was never a true cooperation between Africa and the West. It wasn't for Africa. It was about survival. Western political domination, Western economies, and Western influence have to survive. A covert system of control was established under the guise of development partnerships, aid, and security assistance. Additionally, Burkina Faso was imprisoned within it, much like the rest of West Africa. Under the pretext of anti-insurgency, the French troops arrived. They had one goal in mind: to destroy the Islamist organizations tearing apart the Sahel. However, the insurgents grew every year. Towns collapsed. People perished. Prosperity fell apart. The math was easy for those who experienced it. Things deteriorated the longer the French stayed, pretending that the foreign boots on Sahelian territory were there to defend anybody other than Western geopolitical goals was no longer an option. The same was true of Burkina Faso's economy. Even with its abundance of minerals, zinc, manganese, and gold, the nation was nevertheless among the world's poorest. In order to guarantee that African economies could never fully outgrow their European supervisory territory, its currency, the CFA franc, was nonetheless linked to the French treasury. Every financial choice, including debt deals and infrastructure projects, needed to be approved by Paris or Western-controlled organizations like the IMF. There was never free aid. There were restrictions attached. Make your resources private. Get your marketplaces open. Adopt reforms in the Western style. Even if they caused social disintegration in there were covert tactics: withdrawal of finances, diplomatic isolation proved by planned riots, or worse, if a leader objected. Only under Western conditions was Africa permitted to exist. It was not just a military and economic betrayal. It had a psychological component. Mali, Burkina Faso, and their neighbors were reminded repeatedly of their incapacity in the absence of Western supervision. Instead of being regarded as independent rulers, local administrations were viewed as guardians of Western interests in the Western condition. Only when democracy produced leaders who followed outside regulations was it praised. Only when sovereignty did not obstruct foreign access to important military bases, the Western oil fields, and minerals was it accepted. The appearance of Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not unexpected. After years of exploitation, humiliation, and mounting national indignation, his rise to power was an inevitable explosion. The young people from Burkina Faso, who crowded the streets with anti-French chants and Russian flags, were hyped protesters. They were a generation born into shattered promises, and they had had enough of waiting for unfulfilled Western saviors who crowded. It was hardly political theater when Traoré said that Burkina Faso needed real partners, not masters. It mirrored a profoundly unpleasant reality that common people were already aware of. Burkina Faso had received assistance from the West, and Burkina Faso was left to bleed after it was successful in helping itself. Even assurances of protection became a joke. Insurgents roamed free only a few kilometers distant from French bases, which frequently remained idle. Tracking regional rivals took precedence over defending Burkina Faso citizens in intelligence activities. When Western officials chastised Traoré for refusing to accept their military presence after it had so obviously failed, it was the last insult. The West's lack of concern for victory was evident. It was concerned about staying visible. Therefore, it wasn't a shocking betrayal of old allies when Traoré closed Western military alliances, expelled French forces, and started talking publicly about joining BRICS. A system that had failed Burkina Faso on all fronts was finally being buried. West and East were no longer the exclusive options. Living under constant humiliation or taking a chance on something novel was the choice of betrayal. The Sahelian states' partnership with Niger and Mali came to represent that decision. It would no longer be up to outside forces to decide who could rule, how to sell resources, or which conflicts were worthwhile. Burkina Faso was crying independence in a world where African countries were traditionally penalized for simply speculating about it. However, another concern emerged as the traditional foundations of Western authority in the Sahel started to crumble. Would the BRICS blocked East, which Traoré was wagering on, provide something different? Alternatively, did Burkina Faso just exchange one master for another, wearing different colors? Finding new companions had started, but the wounds from past betrayals would not go away quickly. Did Burkina Faso therefore just exchange? Traoré wasn't merely looking for allies when he reached out to BRICS. For an entire generation, the generation that saw Western promises fall to ashes and determined never to beg again, he was looking for atonement just for another. There is nothing more at risk. Because this goes beyond economic agreements and foreign policy for Burkina Faso, and possibly for all of Africa it's about providing an answer to a question that history has far too frequently ignored. Will Africa ever be able to stand on its own 2 feet and promises? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Now let's go on. BRICS is more than just a bloc to a country like Burkina Faso, which is smothered by long-standing dependencies and scarred by shattered alliances. It stands for the aspiration to change its course. However, history cautions that hope can be harmful, as Captain Traoré and the leaders of Niger and Mali looked east, they noticed an alliance that didn't speak the same language as the West. BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, portrays itself as a coalition of pragmatics rather than a group of ideological missionaries. It promises partnerships without the haughtiness of presumed superiority, trade without lectures, and loans without political preaching. This new horizon appears alluring at first glance. BRICS provides the unconditional respect that Africa has long sought but infrequently obtained. The fundamental tenets of the bloc, sovereignty, non-interference, and mutual development, are in stark contrast to the Western conditional, paternalistic methodology. No calls to overthrow the current regime, no guidelines on how to conduct elections, no secret provisions concealed in glistening assistance packages. The appeal for Burkina Faso is obvious. Through the New Development Bank (NDB), BRICS offers the potential to finance infrastructure without ceding control of economic policy to Washington technocrats. Instead of being stuck in dollar-dominated systems that erode value through hidden expenses, it entails exchanging gold, cotton, and minerals using national currencies. It entails forming security alliances without ceding political authority at home. However, there is a more nuanced reality hidden beneath the promises. BRICS is not a single entity. Its members are deeply divided, especially between China and India, whose competing aspirations and border issues frequently put a pressure on togetherness. Brazil alternates between governments on the left and the right, each with a distinct outlook on global collaboration. Russia is becoming more and more anxious for fresh markets and diplomatic successes as a result of the crippling Western sanctions. Even South Africa, Africa's representative in the BRICS, faces economic difficulties and internal instability. The threat is substantial yet subtle for Burkina Faso. It might fall into the hands of another empire in its attempt to flee, one that is perhaps more cautious, but no less self-centered. Africa already has roads, ports, and railroads thanks to China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. However, it has also left nations with debt they are unable to pay back. Chinese finance first offered freedom from Western lenders in countries like Zambia and Kenya, but when repayment terms became strict, it led to new kinds of dependency. Despite being portrayed as mutual defense alliances, Russian security partnerships frequently put Russian geopolitical objectives ahead of African autonomy. Traoré has a tough task ahead: military cooperation, and infrastructure projects actually benefit Burkina Faso's interests as a whole, not just those of the new partners at the table. Existential stakes are involved. Burkina Faso may become the forerunner of an African development paradigm that combines external alliances with domestic power, if Traoré handles this well. But if he makes a mistake, the nation could end up as a kind state once more, albeit with a different administration. We can be cautiously optimistic. In contrast to coalitions in the West, BRICS does not function under a single command center. No nation is in complete control. Smaller countries have room to negotiate terms, and decisions must be made by agreement. African governments may be able to take on a more active and forceful role in this decentralized structure than they ever could in Western-dominated organizations like the World Bank, IMF, or even ECOWAS. Furthermore, the BRICS expansion plan, which recently invited countries like Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and Egypt to participate in partnership talks, indicates a growing understanding that the bloc's future strength rests on elevating rather than merely exploiting the voices of the global south. This implies that Burkina Faso has a tiny but genuine window to determine its terms of involvement. Traoré's administration must act sensibly, striking a balance between its urgent need for progress and the need to be vigilant in order to prevent falling into new dependency traps. Joining BRICS does not mean as the fight for sovereignty is done. It merely shifts to a new field with greater risks, but also greater rewards. Above all, Burkina Faso needs to keep in mind one difficult lesson that was discovered via painful experience. Newfield Africa must love itself more than any foreign partner, whether it be East or West. The question of whether Burkina Faso can find partners is no longer relevant, as BRICS expands its reach to include the Sahel states. Finding partners that recognize Africa's right to pursue its aspirations and stand up for them against any obstacles is the true question. The dream is real. The test is about to begin. The partners that can it withstand the first acceptance of the new power? Burkina Faso wasn't merely establishing a new alliance when it reached out to BRICS. It was setting a match beneath Africa's brittle Western-influenced architecture. The announcement shocked diplomatic circles in Washington, Paris, and Brussels more than any official declaration of war, according to several. Though the loss of one nation wasn't the only one. It served as a warning that the system itself is in Washington. The silent gearbox that had bound Africa to the capitals of the West duration of war was beginning to fail to several. For more than a century, physical colonization was not always necessary to gain authority over African countries. It changed into something more subdued, iteration of military influence masquerading as counterinsurgency help, financial dependence through organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund around Africa, and political pressure through conditional aid, military influence. This approach guaranteed access to Africa's critical regions, agricultural riches, and minerals, while enabling Western countries to project influence at a low cost. It was a covert system that functioned under several tiers of treaties, Africa's economic agreements, and diplomacy. Traoré's change of direction poses a threat to reveal that system as an unbounded empire. The ramifications are astounding. On a map, Burkina Faso may appear little, but it has great symbolic significance. It holds a crucial position in the Sahel, an area that the West has long deemed necessary for resource access and counterinsurgency operations. Burkina Faso would provide an example for other countries caught in similar situations and others, including Senegal, Chad, Guinea, and even the Ivory Coast, if it could successfully realign toward BRICS and stabilize away from Western influences caught in similar. Western capitals fear not just that Burkina Faso would depart, but also that other countries will do the same, and that the whole notion that Western leadership in Africa is essential will be destroyed. The ripples are already apparent. Mali quickly drew nearer to Russian security contractors after driving out French forces. After spitting from France, Niger looked for new opportunities in Russia, Turkey, and now BRICS. Popular groups in West Africa are becoming more daring and are demonstrating with BRICS banners rather than French flags. A generation that formerly believed that salvation could only come from Washington or Paris is now bold enough to think that salvation could come from inside, or at the very least, from partners who care about them more than they do about chess pieces. The Western playbook is starting to crumble under the strain in response. Once the go-to method for reprimanding dissident regimes, sanctions have mainly failed. Using new trade alliances, internal production drives, and nationalist fervor that Western officials did not foresee, Burkina Faso and its allies have resisted financial sanctions with surprising tenacity. Threats from the military are also less effective. When Western-backed ECOWAS interventions failed to overthrow coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, their credibility crumbled. There was no interest in organizing neighboring states against Traoré's administration. The old strategies of diplomatic censure, economic isolation, and covert destabilization are no longer effective. For Western strategists, this has produced a perilous moment as they realize that once influence is gone, it is difficult to recapture. In previous decades, Ouagadougou's leadership might be changed by a simple phone call from Paris or Washington. These days, those calls are either ignored or, worse, derided in public. The dread in the West is not unfounded. The ramifications of Africa realigning with BRICS go well beyond geopolitics. It would cause disturbance. However, Traoré does not represent a military, economic or even diplomatic danger to the West. It's a psychological issue. He provides evidence that the empire is not unbeatable by having the guts to refuse and yet live. That is still possible for a small, landlocked nation without nuclear weapons, a sizable army, or connections to Wall Street to chart its own course and challenge the most powerful interests on the planet. The West is genuinely afraid of that pandemic. Hope, not rebellion. I hope that Africa can be great with our permission. I hope that sovereignty is a right that can be recovered, not just a pipe dream. The old world order, which was based on subdued dominance and civilized exportation, might fall apart more quickly than anyone is willing to acknowledge if Burkina Faso's experiment is successful. Even if it is successful, Traoré and his supporters will face another obstacle. Can they transform dreams into enduring power and rebellion into resilience? For standing up is just the beginning of the fight. Staying upright and avoiding new pitfalls will be the true battle of the future. With its audacious claims of respect, sovereignty, and multipolarity, BRICS makes enticing claims. The new development bank is open to everyone, regardless of political affiliation. Instead of using dollars, exchange national currencies. Investments in infrastructure are meant to elevate, not to control. This vision, which has been harmed by decades of bullying by the West, is meant to resonate with all countries. However, there are still important questions at the core. At its core, BRICS remains a confederation of nations with vested interests. Each of its countries has its own goals, priorities, and red lines. And the smaller, weaker members are asked to compromise when those goals clash, which is inevitable. For example, China's history in Africa is one of both promise and risk. Asked to compromise, Beijing has constructed ports, power plants, roads, and airports frequently more quickly and affordably than any Western business would venture. However, it is also called for authority over important assets in the event that obligations are not paid. 99-year leases on strategic ports. Chinese state-owned companies coveted buying mining concessions. Despite their impressiveness, certain infrastructure projects prioritize the demands of Chinese exporters over those of African economies. It's also important to carefully consider Russia's assurances of security alliances and military cooperation. Moscow is keen to establish partnerships, send out private contractors, and sell weapons. However, it is motivated by its own interests. Africa is not a humanitarian endeavor for Russia. It serves as a battleground for influence on the European Union and NATO. Even India, which is frequently left out of these conversations, views Africa as a market for technology, pharmaceuticals, and political clout in the global south. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Countries behave in their own best interests. However, it implies that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will have to navigate BRICS with the same caution, skepticism, and difficult discussions that they once wished they had used in their Western partnerships. Still, a lot of people believe it will be superior to the West. Fragmentation is another risk. The BRICS group as a whole is not very cohesive. There is a geopolitical competition between China and India in particular. Russia, cut off from the West, is keen to strengthen its ties with the BRICS. However, under pressed, its desperation may either make the bloc stronger or weaker. Depending on who is in charge, Brazil alternates between isolationism and internationalism. Internal political unrest, even in South Africa, could divert attention from its aspirations on a global scale. To put it briefly, BRICS is not a single entity heading in a direction that is obvious. It is a fleet of various ships, each of which is somewhat restraining the others. This presents both risk and opportunity for Africa. Risk because internal BRICS disputes have the potential to weaken, postpone, or sabotage pledges. Opportunity because African governments have the freedom to negotiate, set partners against one another where needed, and carve out favorable conditions without being tied to a single hegemon, in contrast to Western frameworks, where commands are simply handed out. This calls for leaders like Captain Traoré to exhibit a new form of leadership, one that is both courageous and astute in terms of strategy, to make sure that foreign partnerships support domestic development, rather than foreign extraction. It calls for the establishment of robust, technocratic domestic institutions capable of handling foreign agreements without devolving into dependency. Creation of regional blocs, such as the Alliance of Sahel States, that negotiate collectively to increase bargaining power domestic and significant investments in domestic industries like manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. Above all, it requires the guts to refuse accords that could lead to a recurrence of past blunders, even from China, Russia, and the BRICS. Africa is given the opportunity to sit at a new table through BRICS, but this does not ensure that it will be served. The flags and rhetoric of Burkina Faso and SIC will not be used to evaluate its revolution. In 5, 10, or 20 years, its children will be evaluated based on whether they work in industries that provide for their own families and rather than multinational corporations, travel roads they owe resolution, and drink water from systems they control. In the past, the West promised cooperation, but ended up delivering dominance. And Traoré won't be able to trust the disaster as readily if BRICS follow suit. For after centuries of conflict, Africa will have failed to see that true independence must be created, fought for, and safeguarded daily. In actuality, though, this man is not a fool. He is well aware of his actions. More significantly, he understands how to join BRICS without taking on the role of the puppet Russia. Traoré is aware that true sovereignty entails collaboration rather than deference. Just consider how BRICS itself had to adjust and make concessions during its growth, if anyone is still concerned. BRICS is not an empire that demands allegiance. Even giants bow at this table when called upon. Traoré is strategically using his cards as growth, and thus far, he has demonstrated that he is prepared to use BRICS to advance Burkina Faso rather than bow down to it. Can Traoré, and the new Africa he stands for then, actually create a future that is independent? Or they have to start the battle over? Tell us in the space provided for comments. Has the future of Burkina Faso been assured? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history and culture all over, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.